quiet village of Danefield, a cryptic invitation draws Miss Jane Marple to Thornfield Hall, where a golden amulet from an ancient cult lies hidden, sparking greed and deceit. As a broken vase, a lost earring, and late-night secrets unravel, Miss Marple's keen eye pierces the shadows of suspicion, exposing a web of betrayal in a grand manner. Will she unearth the truth before danger strikes? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Thornfield. In the tranquil village of Danefield, where the hedgerows bloomed with late autumn hawthorn, and the church bell tolled with comforting regularity, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest sitting room at Rose Cottage. The room, with its chintz curtains and well-polished mahogany table, exuded a quiet charm, much like Miss Marple herself. Her nimble fingers worked a pair of knitting needles, coaxing a pale blue shawl into existence, while her sharp eyes occasionally flicked toward the window, noting the comings and goings of village life. Danefield, though not her native St. Mary Mead, had a familiar rhythm, a gentle pulse of gossip and routine that suited her observational habits. It was a crisp October morning when the postman, young Tom Wheeler, arrived with his usual cheerful whistle. Among the usual bills and circulars was an envelope of uncommon elegance, its thick cream paper embossed with a crest depicting a laurel wreath encircling a lyre. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly as she slit it open with a silver letter knife, a gift from her nephew Raymond. The letter was from a Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, a name unfamiliar to her, inviting her to spend a fortnight at Thornfield Hall, a grand estate near the market town of Athens, some 30 miles from Danefield. The tone was polite but urgent, hinting at a matter of some delicacy that required Miss Marple's unique discernment. A postscript mentioned that Mrs. Grayson had heard of Miss Marple's reputation through a mutual acquaintance, Lady Conway, whom Miss Marple vaguely recalled from a long-ago garden party. Intrigued, Miss Marple penned a courteous acceptance. She had no pressing engagements, and the prospect of a mystery, for she was certain there was one, stirred her curiosity. Besides, a change of scene might do her good, though she would miss her daily chats with Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, who had a knack for relaying village tittle-tattle with unintended precision. 3 days later, Miss Marple arrived at Thornfield Hall, her small suitcase carried by a courteous driver sent by Mrs. Grayson. The hall was a splendid Georgian pile, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the slanting sunlight, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes. Ivy clung to the walls, and a gravel drive swept past manicured lawns to a portico framed by columns. As Miss Marple stepped out, she noted the air of grandeur tempered by something less tangible. A faint unease, perhaps, lurking in the shadows of the yew trees. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson greeted her in the entrance hall, a lofty space adorned with marble busts and a chandelier that tinkled faintly in the draught. She was a tall woman, perhaps 50, with grey eyes that held both warmth and wariness. Her silver-streaked hair was swept into an elegant chignon, but her hands betrayed a nervous habit, twisting a lace handkerchief as she spoke. "Miss Marple, I'm so grateful you've come," she said, her voice low. "I do hope you'll find Thornfield comfortable." Over tea in a drawing-room lined with damask wallpaper, Mrs. Grayson introduced the household. Her stepson, Philip Grayson, was an archaeologist recently returned from a dig near Athens. "A brilliant mind," she said, "but rather intense." His fiancée, Clara Beaumont, was a young actress full of spirit, though perhaps a touch impulsive. Dr. Harold Vance, a family friend and local physician, was described as dependable, if a bit reserved. Miss Lydia Trent, a distant cousin, lived at Thornfield on Mrs. Grayson's charity. She was fond of conversation, Mrs. Grayson added diplomatically. The staff comprised Mr. Bates, the butler, a man of impeccable decorum. Mrs. Harrow, the cook, known for her temper as much as her soufflés, and Jenny, a young maid with a timid air. As they sipped Earl Grey from porcelain cups, Mrs. Grayson leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's something wrong here, Miss Marple. I can't put my finger on it, but it's as though the house itself is holding its breath. Secrets, perhaps, old ones buried deep." She gave a small, nervous laugh. "You must think me fanciful." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Not at all, Mrs. Grayson. Houses, like people, often have their secrets. And secrets, in my experience, have a way of making themselves known." As they finished tea, Miss Marple observed the room. The heavy velvet drapes, the polished silver candlesticks, the portrait of a stern-faced man, presumably the late Mr. Grayson, gazing down from above the fireplace. There was a stillness here, but not a peaceful one. It was, she thought, the stillness of a stage before the curtain rises, when the actors are poised, waiting for their cue. And Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and her knack for noticing what others overlooked, was ready to watch the drama unfold. Chapter 2. The Whisper of the Past. The dining room at Thornfield Hall was a spectacle of old-world elegance, its long mahogany table polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting the soft flicker of a chandelier adorned with 100 prisms. Miss Jane Marple, seated between Mrs. Eleanor Grayson and Dr. Harold Vance, absorbed the scene with her customary quiet alertness. The air was rich with the aroma of roasted pheasant, underpinned by the subtle fragrance of beeswax from the candelabra, and a hint of lavender from the table's centerpiece. Yet, beneath the veneer of civility, marked by the gentle clink of silver against porcelain, and the idaic murmur of polite conversation, Miss Marple detected a tension as palpable as the first chill of an approaching storm. Philip Grayson presided at the head of the table, his dark eyes fixed on his plate, his responses to queries clipped and evasive. He was a striking figure, in his early 30s, with a scholar's lean frame and a face that might have been handsome were it not for the shadow of preoccupation that clung to him. His fiancée, Clara Beaumont, sat opposite, her auburn hair catching the candlelight like burnished copper. Her laughter rang out frequently, a bright melodic sound that filled the room, yet Miss Marple noted its artificial edge. As though it were a performance rehearsed one too many times, Miss Lydia Trent, positioned across from Miss Marple, wore a perpetual expression of disapproval. Her thin lips pursed as she cast sidelong glances at Clara. Mrs. Grayson, at the table's foot, maintained a gracious demeanour, though her fingers toyed nervously with the pearl brooch pinned to her silk blouse, betraying an inner disquiet. The conversation, initially light, turned to the antiquities of Athens, prompted by Dr. Vance, a man of middle age with a ruddy complexion, and a manner that suggested both confidence and caution. "I was at a lecture last week on the local ruins," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to putting others at ease. "Remarkable work you're doing, Philip. That temple site. Quite the discovery, I hear. A hidden chamber, wasn't it?" His hazel eyes gleamed with curiosity. But there was something else there, Miss Marple thought, a probing quality, as though he were testing the waters. Philip's hand paused, his fork hovering above a slice of pheasant. "It's early days," he said curtly, his gaze flicking to Dr. Vance with a hint of wariness. "Just a few stones and some old pottery. Nothing to excite the imagination yet." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the stem of his wineglass a fraction too tightly. He was hiding something, she was certain, and not merely from professional modesty. Clara leaned forward, her green eyes sparkling with mischief. "Oh, Philip, don't be so dull. You told me yourself it's the find of the century. A chamber untouched for millennia. Surely that's worth a story or two." Her voice was teasing, but there was an undercurrent of challenge, as though she were daring him to contradict her. The table fell silent for a moment, the clatter of cutlery stilled, and Miss Marple noted the quick glance Mrs. Grayson shot her stepson, her brow creasing with concern. Philip's smile was tight, almost a grimace. "Let's not bore our guests with archaeological minutiae," he said, his tone final. "Clara, perhaps you could tell us about your latest role instead." It was a deft deflection, but it did not go unnoticed. Miss Lydia Trent seized the moment, her voice sharp as a needle. "Yes, do tell us, Miss Beaumont. I'm sure your theatrical exploits are far more entertaining than dusty old ruins. Actresses, after all, are so skilled at playing parts." Her words carried a venomous edge, thinly veiled as banter, and Clara's cheeks flushed, though she masked it with a laugh that was just a shade too loud. Miss Marple sipped her claret, her eyes moving from face to face, cataloguing each reaction. Miss Trent's barb was not mere spite. It hinted at a deeper resentment, perhaps rooted in envy of Clara's youth and vitality. Philip's reticence about his work suggested a secret he was determined to protect, while Clara's insistence on drawing it out felt less like affection and more like provocation. And Mrs. Grayson's nervous glances, those spoke of a woman who sensed trouble but lacked the means to name it. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was much the same whether in Danefield or the grandest of halls, predictable in its frailties, yet endlessly fascinating. After dinner, as the party adjourned to the drawing-room for coffee, served in delicate Sèvres cups, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a desire for a breath of air. Wrapping her knitted shawl about her shoulders, she stepped into the garden, where the October night was crisp and clear, the moon casting a silver glow over the manicured hedges and the distant outline of the yew walk. The air carried the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of late roses, their petals drooping under the weight of dew. She wandered toward the rose garden, her steps soft on the gravel path, guided by an instinct that told her secrets were seldom confined to drawing rooms. Voices, low and urgent, reached her ears as she neared a trellis draped with climbing roses. She paused, half hidden by a stone urn, and listened. It was Philip, his tone taut with suppressed anger. "You mustn't speak of it, Clara. Not to her, not to anyone. It's not just a find. It's dangerous. You don't understand what's at stake." His silhouette was sharp against the moonlight, his hands clenched at his sides. Clara's reply was softer, but carried a defiant edge. "I'm not some naive girl, Philip. I heard you and Vance talking about its value, its power. You can't keep me in the dark forever." Her voice trembled, not with fear, Miss Marple thought, but with a mix of frustration and determination. Before more could be said, the crunch of gravel underfoot, perhaps a passing servant, silenced them, and they moved apart, their figures melting into the shadows. Miss Marple retreated soundlessly, her heart steady despite the thrill of discovery. Back in her room, she lit the bedside lamp, its warm glow illuminating the chintz-covered walls. As she reached for her handbag to retrieve her knitting, her fingers brushed against an unfamiliar object. It was a fragment of clay, rough and cool to the touch, slipped under her door while she'd been at If's dinner. Turning it over in the lamplight, she studied the faint etchings, symbols that might have been Greek or perhaps older, carrying the weight of centuries. It was no tourist bauble. It felt ancient, almost alive with secrets. She placed it carefully in her handbag, beside her spectacles, and sat back, her lips pursed in thought. Someone in Thornfield Hall was sending a message, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and her knack for seeing what others missed, was ready to decipher it. The game, she sensed, had begun, and she would play it with the patience of one who knew that truths, like roses, often bloomed in the quietest corners. Chapter 3. The Shadow in the Library. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Thornfield Hall, casting dappled light across the parquet floor of the breakfast room. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small table with a view of the Dukist lawns, sipped her tea and observed the household with her usual quiet vigilance. The room was less formal than the dining hall, its walls adorned with pastoral watercolours, but the atmosphere was no less strained. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, her face pale beneath her carefully applied powder, toyed with a slice of toast while Philip Grayson, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep, read a newspaper with forced concentration. Clara Beaumont was absent, her place set but untouched, and Miss Lydia Trent, nibbling a scone, darted sharp glances about the room, as though seeking a target for her next barb. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her feet, made polite conversation with Mrs. Grayson about the local flora, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over the clay fragment now nestled in her handbag. Its presence was a puzzle, its symbols a cipher she could not yet read. She resolved to visit the library after breakfast, suspecting that Philip's work might offer a clue to its origin. The library at Thornfield was a cavernous space, its high shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, and its air heavy with the scent of old paper and polished oak. A long table stood at the centre, strewn with maps and notebooks, where Philip sat, his head bent over a sketch of what appeared to be a temple layout. Mrs. Grayson had accompanied Miss Marple, perhaps out of courtesy or curiosity, and stood by a window, her silhouette framed against the morning light. "Good morning, Philip," Miss Marple said brightly, settling into a chair near the table. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I've always been fascinated by history, you know, such stories in old stones." Her tone was light, but her eyes were keen, noting the way Philip's hand tightened on his pencil. "Not at all, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice polite but distant. "Just sorting through some notes from the dig." He gestured to the sketch, which showed a series of chambers beneath a temple, one marked with a curious symbol, a circle bisected by a wavy line. "We found a sealed chamber last month. Quite unexpected. It's promising, but there's much we don't understand yet." Miss Marple leaned forward, her spectacles glinting. A sealed chamber. How thrilling! Was it empty, or did you find anything of note? Her question was gentle, almost casual, but she watched his reaction closely. Philip hesitated, his gaze flicking to Mrs. Grayson, who was now examining a book on the shelf. Some pottery, a few inscriptions, he said vaguely. Nothing remarkable? But his fingers drummed on the table, and Miss Marple noted the lie in his guarded tone. He was protecting something, she was certain, perhaps the very thing connected to the fragment in her possession. Before she could press further, Miss Lydia Trent swept into the room, her thin frame swathed in a drab brown dress that did little to soften her angular features. "Miss Marple, you're here already, poking about in dusty corners," she said with a smile that was more grimace than greeting. "Philip's work is terribly dull, I'm afraid. All dirt and broken bits of clay. Not like Clara's world. Such glamour, such secrets." Her eyes gleamed with malice as she pronounced the last word, and Philip's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Mrs. Grayson turned from the shelf, her expression weary. "Lydia, must you always stir the pot? Miss Marple is our guest." But Miss Trent merely sniffed, undeterred, and launched into a tale of a local scandal involving a vicar's wife, her voice dripping with relish. Miss Marple listened politely, her needles clicking softly as she drew a skein of wool from her bag. Miss Trent's gossip, she knew, was a weapon, wielded with precision to wound or unsettle. But it was also a window into the household's undercurrents. Envy, suspicion, and something darker, perhaps. She filed away the spinster's words, noting the particular venom reserved for Clara. The morning passed quietly until a sudden commotion disrupted the house. A piercing scream echoed from the drawing-room, followed by the sound of shattering porcelain. Miss Marple, with Mrs. Grayson and Philip in tow, hurried to the source. There, in the centre of the room, stood Jenny, the young maid, her face ashen as she stared at the floor. Scattered across the rug were the shards of a delicate vase, its blue and white pattern unmistakably ancient, much like the fragment Miss Marple had found. "Oh, madam," Jenny stammered, wringing her hands, "I didn't mean to. It was on the table, and I only brushed it with my duster, and it fell." Her eyes were wide with panic, but Miss Marple's gaze was drawn to the shards. Kneeling with surprising agility for her age, she examined them, noting their thickness and the faint trace of similar symbols etched into the glaze. It was no ordinary vase, she thought, and its destruction was no accident. Mrs. Grayson clutched her brooch, her voice trembling. "That was my husband's, one of his treasures from Greece. How could this happen?" Her distress was genuine, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of fear, as though the vase's loss signified something greater. Philip crouched beside Miss Marple, his face pale. "It's just a vase," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes lingered on the fragments with something akin to dread. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from a morning walk, and gasped at the scene. "What's happened?" she asked, her tone more curious than concerned. Miss Trent, who had followed the commotion, smirked. "Careless maids and precious heirlooms don't mix, do they? Or perhaps someone wanted it broken." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miss Marple rose, brushing her hands together. "Accidents do happen," she said mildly, "but they often have a purpose, don't they?" Her eyes met Philip's for a moment, and she saw a flicker of unease before he looked away. The vase, she suspected, was linked to the clay fragment, and to the secret Philip was so determined to guard. As the household dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her mind sifting through the morning's events. The library, the vase, the whispered argument in the garden, each was a piece of a larger puzzle. She returned to her room, where she retrieved the clay fragment and studied it anew. Its symbols matched those on the broken vase, confirming her suspicion that both were tied to Philip's excavation. Someone, she thought, was sending a warning, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence and her knack for seeing through the fog of human motives, was determined to uncover why. Chapter 4. The Nighttime Intruder. The moon hung low over Thornfield Hall, its pale light seeping through the heavy drapes of Miss Jane Marple's guest room, casting faint shadows across the damask wallpaper. She sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting idle in her lap, her thoughts as sharp as the needles she held. The events of the day, the broken vase, Philip's guarded demeanour, Miss Trent's venomous insinuations, had woven a tapestry of suspicion, and the clay fragment, now tucked safely in her handbag, was a thread she could not yet place. Sleep eluded her, not from discomfort, but from the restless hum of her mind, attuned to the subtle discords of human behaviour. A faint creak in the corridor snapped her to attention. It was not the settling of an old house, nor the scurry of a mouse, but the deliberate tread of a footstep, cautious and measured. Miss Marple, with the agility of one accustomed to moving unnoticed, slipped on her dressing gown and eased open her door. The hallway was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight spilling from a window at its end. And there, moving toward the library, was a shadowy figure. She followed, her slippers silent on the polished floor, her breath steady despite the thrill of pursuit. Years of observing village intrigues had taught her the value of discretion, and she moved like a wraith, keeping to the gate shadows. The figure paused at the library door, producing a key that glinted briefly in the dim light. As the door swung open, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Philip Grayson's profile, his face taut with purpose. He slipped inside, and she waited, counting to 10 before easing the door ajar. Through the crack she saw him cross to a tall oak cabinet, its glass panels reflecting the moonlight. With a soft click, he unlocked it and withdrew a small cloth-wrapped bundle, which he tucked into his pocket before glancing about, as though sensing a watcher. Miss Marple drew back, her heart calm but her mind racing. What was it that Philip guarded so fiercely, and why conceal it in the dead of night? She returned to her room, her steps as silent as her thoughts were loud. Settling back in her chair, she considered the bundle. It was too small for pottery, too deliberate for a mere keepsake. Could it be the artifact hinted at in Philip's reticence, the one tied to the temple chamber? And if so, why hide it from his own household? Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, the rhythmic click a counterpoint to her musings. People, she reflected, hid things for only a handful of reasons: fear, greed, or shame. And Philip's actions suggested the first, perhaps mingled with the second. The next morning, the breakfast room was subdued, the air thick with unspoken tensions. Clara appeared, her eyes red-rimmed, claiming a restless night. "Someone was in my room," she announced, her voice trembling with a mix of indignation and unease. "My jewellery box was moved. Nothing's missing, but I know it was touched." Her gaze darted to Philip, who frowned but said nothing, his attention fixed on his coffee. "Mrs. Grayson," her hands fluttering to her brooch, looked alarmed. "Are you certain, Clara? Perhaps Jenny was tidying." But the maid, hovering near the sideboard, shook her head vigorously, her face pale. Miss Trent, slicing her grapefruit with surgical precision, offered a thin smile. "Actresses do love a bit of drama, don't they? Perhaps you imagined it, my dear." Her tone was laced with mockery, and Clara's flush deepened. Miss Marple, spreading marmalade on her toast, observed the exchange with interest. Clara's distress, while theatrical, seemed genuine, and Miss Trent's barb was calculated to wound. But it was Philip's silence that intrigued her most. He avoided Clara's eyes, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the table. Was he the intruder, searching for something Clara might have taken? Or was another hand at work, stirring the household's unease? Determined to gather more pieces of the puzzle, Miss Marple accepted Dr. Vance's offer of a morning walk into Athens. The town was a charming sprawl of cobblestone streets and half-timbered shops. Its market square bustling with vendors hawking apples and wool. As they strolled past a Norman church, Dr. Vance spoke of the local ruins, his tone casual, but his eyes watchful. "Philip's made quite a name for himself with that temple," he said. "Rumour has it they found something extraordinary, an amulet perhaps, tied to an old cult. Some say it's cursed, but you know how villagers love their tales." He chuckled, but Miss Marple noted the probing glance he cast her way. As though gauging her reaction, she smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling behind her spectacles. "Curses are such romantic notions, aren't they? But I find human motives far more compelling. Greed, for instance, can make people do the most curious things." Her tone was light, but Dr. Vance's chuckle faltered, and he quickly changed the subject to the weather. Back at Thornfield, Miss Marple sought out the library again, hoping to examine the cabinet Philip had opened. It was locked, its glass panels revealing only shelves of books and a few decorative figurines. She lingered, her fingers trailing over the table where Philip's maps still lay. One, half unrolled, showed the temple site in greater detail, with annotations in Philip's precise hand. A note in the margin caught her eye: "Amulet, secure at all costs." Her lips pursed. The word confirmed Dr. Vance's rumour, but it was Philip's urgency that intrigued her. What made this amulet worth such secrecy? As she left the library, she encountered Jenny, the maid, dusting a bust in the hall. The girl started, her eyes wide. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me a fright. I'm that jumpy since the vase broke." Her voice quavered, and Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "No harm done, my dear," she said. "But tell me, do you often see Mr. Philip in the library at night?" It was a shot in the dark, but Jenny's flush confirmed it. "Sometimes, miss," she admitted. "He's been working late, ever since the dig started. Says it's quieter then." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "But I saw him once, carrying something wrapped up, like he didn't want anyone to see." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alight. The bundle, the amulet, the broken vase, the rifled jewellery box, each was a fragment of a larger picture, one she was beginning to glimpse. Someone in Thornfield was playing a dangerous game, and Philip was at its centre. But whether he was hunter or hunted, she could not yet say. As she returned to her room, her knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the storm she sensed, gathering within the walls of Thornfield Hall. Chapter 5. The Discovery in the Ruins. The morning air was crisp as Miss Jane Marple set out from Thornfield Hall, her sturdy shoes crunching on the gravel path leading towards the Athens ruins. She had persuaded Philip Grayson to guide her to the excavation site, citing an amateur's curiosity about ancient history. In truth, her interest lay not in the stones, but in the secrets they guarded. Secrets hinted at by the clay fragment, the broken vase, and Philip's nocturnal forays. Her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, she walked with a sprightly step that belied her years, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, missing nothing. Philip, though initially reluctant, had agreed to the outing, perhaps sensing that Miss Marple's mild demeanour masked a persistence not easily rebuffed. He carried a leather satchel, his expression guarded as they traversed the rolling fields that separated Thornfield from the ruins. The site lay a mile distant, a sprawl of weathered stones and half-buried columns nestled in a shallow valley. The air smelled of earth and time, and the distant bleat of sheep mingled with the rustle of wind through the grasses. As they approached, Miss Marple noted the orderly chaos of the excavation. Wooden stakes marked with twine, a scattering of tools, and a canvas tent where a young assistant scribbled notes. Philip gestured toward a low mound, its surface pitted with recent digging. "This is the temple," he said, his voice clipped. "Or what's left of it. We've uncovered parts of the outer walls and a subterranean chamber." He pointed to a stone-lined entrance, now boarded up with rough planks. "That's where we found some significant artifacts." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite fascination. "A chamber, you say? How thrilling! And sealed, I understand. It must have felt like opening a door to the past." Her tone was light, but her eyes lingered on Philip's face, noting the flicker of unease that crossed it. "Yes, sealed," he admitted, shifting his satchel to the other shoulder. "It hadn't been touched in centuries. We found pottery, some inscriptions, nothing extraordinary." But his words were too quick, his gaze too averted, and Miss Marple knew he was withholding more than he revealed. The amulet, she suspected, was the heart of it, a secret he guarded with a fervour bordering on fear. They wandered the site, Philip explaining the layout with a scholar's precision, though his enthusiasm seemed forced. Miss Marple paused by a crumbled pillar, her fingers brushing the weathered stone as she scanned the ground. A glint in the underbrush caught her eye, a small gold earring, its filigree design unmistakable. She recognized it as Clara's, having seen her wear a similar pair at dinner. Stooping as if to adjust her shoe, she palmed the earring and slipped it into her pocket, her face betraying nothing. Clara, it seemed, had been here, and recently, perhaps searching for the same secret Philip concealed. As they returned to Thornfield, Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter topics, the beauty of the countryside, the charm of Athens Market Square. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the threads of the mystery. The earring suggested Clara's involvement. But was it curiosity, greed, or something else? And why had Philip boarded up the chamber, if not to protect something within? Back at the hall, the afternoon was disrupted by Miss Lydia Trent, who cornered Miss Marple in the conservatory, where potted ferns cast lacy shadows across the tiled floor. Miss Trent's eyes gleamed with the fervour of a gossip in her element. "You've been to the ruins, I hear," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Philip's obsessed with that place, you know. Ever since he found that chamber, he's been different, secretive, jumpy, and Clara—" She paused for effect, her lips curling. "She's been sniffing about, too. Thinks she's clever, but I've seen her type before. All charm and no substance." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking as she worked on her shawl. "You're very observant, Miss Trent," she said, her tone encouraging but neutral. "Have you heard any tales about the ruins? Old legends, perhaps?" Miss Trent leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Oh, there's talk in Athens, silly stories, of course, but persistent. They say the temple was home to a cult centuries ago, guarding a secret so powerful it could ruin lives. A golden amulet, some say, tied to rituals best forgotten." She shivered theatrically, but her eyes were alight with malice. "Philip would know, wouldn't he? He's been digging up more than he admits." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Legends, she knew, were often the husks of truth, and Miss Trent's tale aligned too neatly with Dr. Vance's earlier hint of a cursed amulet. But it was the spinster's eagerness to implicate Clara that intrigued her most. Envy could sharpen the tongue, but it could also blind the eye. And Miss Trent's dislike of the young actress was a lens that distorted as much as it revealed. That evening, as the household gathered for drinks in the drawing room, Miss Marple observed the players anew. Clara, radiant in a green silk dress, clung to Philip's arm, her laughter a touch too bright. Philip, though attentive, seemed distracted, his eyes straying to the window as if expecting an unseen visitor. Dr. Vance, pouring sherry with a steady hand, spoke of local history, but his glances at Philip were too frequent, too searching. Mrs. Grayson, her brooch glinting in the lamplight, watched them all with a mother's anxious care, while Miss Trent, sipping her drink, wore a smirk that promised trouble. Miss Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, let the conversation wash over her, her mind sifting through the day's discoveries. The earring placed Clara at the ruins, perhaps prying into Philip's secret. The amulet, if it existed, was the key, a prize worth hiding, worth stealing. And the clay fragment, with its ancient symbols, was a message, perhaps a warning, from someone who knew more than they admitted. As she watched the firelight dance across the room, Miss Marple felt the puzzle taking shape, its pieces scattered but not beyond her reach. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth, like the ruins themselves, lay, buried beneath layers of deception, waiting for her patient hands to unearth it. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The morning at Thornfield Hall dawned grey and heavy, the sky bruised with clouds that mirrored the mounting tension within its walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the breakfast room with her tea and toast, observed the household with the quiet intensity of one who sensed a storm approaching. The air was thick with unspoken grievances, and the clatter of cutlery seemed to punctuate the silence rather than break it. Philip Grayson, his face drawn, barely touched his eggs, while Clara Beaumont, her eyes shadowed, picked at a grapefruit with a distracted air. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, her fingers twisting the ever-present pearl brooch, attempted to steer the conversation toward the upcoming harvest festival in Athens, but her voice faltered under the weight of the room's mood. Miss Lydia Trent, however, was in her element, her sharp eyes darting from face to face as she buttered her toast with deliberate care. "Clara, You look positively peaky," she remarked, her tone laced with false concern. "Late nights, perhaps? Or is it the strain of keeping up appearances?" The barb landed, and Clara's fork clattered to her plate, her cheeks flaming. "That's enough, Lydia," Mrs. Grayson snapped, her patience fraying. "You've been needling Clara all week. If you've something to say, out with it." Her outburst startled the table, and even Dr. Harold Vance, who had just entered with his usual genial smile, paused, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. Clara rose, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't need to sit here and be insulted," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Philip, are you coming?" She looked to her fiancé, but Philip's gaze remained fixed on his plate, his silence a rebuke. With a stifled sob, Clara stormed out, the door slamming behind her. Philip hesitated, then followed, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Miss Marple, her expression serene, sipped her tea, but her mind was alight. The household was at a breaking point, and she knew the time had come to draw the threads of her observations together. The clay fragment, the broken vase, Clara's earring at the ruins, Philip's nocturnal secrecy, and Miss Trent's venom, all pointed to a truth buried not in the ruins of Athens, but in the hearts of those at Thornfield. She resolved to act before the tensions erupted into something more dangerous. That afternoon, she requested a gathering in the drawing-room, her tone so mild that none could refuse without seeming churlish. The room, with its velvet drapes and polished silver, felt stifling despite the open windows, as though the air itself held its breath. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her knitting bag at her feet, her posture unassuming, but her eyes bright with purpose. The household assembled, Mrs. Grayson, her face anxious, Philip, his jaw tight, Clara, her arms crossed, defensively, Dr. Vance, his smile strained, and Miss Trent, her lips curled in anticipation of drama. "I've been a guest here for only a few days," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but clear. "But I've seen enough to know that something troubles this house. Secrets, like weeds, have a way of choking what's good if left unchecked." She reached into her handbag and produced the clay fragment, its etched symbols catching the light. "This was slipped under my door, and I believe it's no mere trinket. It's tied to the vase that was broken, and to the ruins where you, Philip, have been working." Philip's face paled, but he remained silent, his hands clenched. Miss Marple turned to Clara, producing the gold earring from her pocket. "And this, Clara, I found at the ruins. You've been there, haven't you? Perhaps looking for something you overheard Philip discuss?" Clara's eyes widened, but she bit her lip, saying nothing. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. "There's talk of an amulet, a golden relic from the temple, valuable and perhaps dangerous. Philip, you've hidden it, haven't you? In the library cabinet, wrapped in cloth, to keep it from prying hands." Philip started, his mouth opening, but Miss Marple pressed on, her voice steady. "And someone else knows. Someone who's been watching, stirring trouble, to distract from their own designs." She turned to Miss Trent, whose smirk faltered. "You've been quick to point fingers, Miss Trent, particularly at Clara. Your tales of her past, your hints about her motives, they're meant to sow discord, aren't they? But you've seen more than you've admitted. Perhaps you saw Philip in the library, or Clara at the ruins, and thought to use it to your advantage." Miss Trent's face flushed, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't know what you mean," she snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Grayson, her eyes wide, looked from Miss Marple to her stepson. "Philip, is this true? Have you been hiding something? And Clara, what were you doing at the ruins?" Before either could respond, Dr. Vance cleared his throat, his genial mask slipping. "Miss Marple, you're spinning quite a tale, but it's all speculation. There's no proof of any amulet or of anyone's ill intent." His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. "Proof is a curious thing, Dr. Vance," she said mildly. "It's often in the small details, say the scent of pipe tobacco in the library at night, or the creak of a floorboard when someone thinks they're alone." She paused, letting the words settle. "You've been interested in Philip's find, haven't you? More than a friend's curiosity, perhaps." The room fell silent, the tension as taut as a drawn bowstring. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unyielding, moved from face to face, seeing the fear, the guilt, the secrets each held. She had not yet named the full truth, but she had set the stage, and the players, she knew, would soon reveal themselves. For now, she stepped back, her hands folded demurely, content to let the weight of her words work their quiet magic. Chapter 7. The Truth Unearthed. The drawing room at Thornfield Hall seemed to hold its breath, as Miss Jane Marple's words hung in the air. Each syllable a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of unease through the assembled company. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the faces of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, Philip Grayson, Clara Beaumont, Dr. Harold Vance, and Miss Lydia Trent. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her slight figure almost lost in the grandeur of the room. Yet her presence commanded attention, her eyes bright with the quiet certainty of one who saw truths others missed. She folded her hands, her voice calm but unrelenting. "Secrets, as I've said, have a way of surfacing, like stones pushed up by the frost. Let us be plain with one another." She turned to Philip, whose knuckles were white as he gripped the arm of his chair. "Philip, you found more than pottery in that temple chamber, didn't you? A golden amulet, perhaps, tied to an ancient cult. You've hidden it in the library cabinet, fearing its theft or its power." Philip's face drained of colour, his lips parting as if to protest, but no words came. Mrs. Grayson gasped, her hand flying to her pearl brooch. "Philip, is this true? Have you been keeping such a thing from me?" Her voice trembled with a mix of hurt and disbelief. Miss Marple continued, her gaze shifting to Clara. "And you, Clara, overheard Philip and Dr. Vance discussing this amulet, didn't you? Its value tempted you, perhaps, and you went to the ruins searching for answers. That's where you lost your earring." She held up the gold filigree, its delicate design glinting in the firelight. Clara's eyes widened, her hands twisting in her lap, but she remained silent, her defiance crumbling under Miss Marple's scrutiny. Miss Trent, her smirk replaced by a scowl, leaned forward. "Really, Miss Marple, this is absurd. You're accusing us all based on a bit of clay and an earring. Clara's always been a schemer. Anyone can see that. But to suggest Philip's hiding some cursed relic is pure fancy." Her voice was sharp, but Miss Marple caught the tremor in it, the fear of being seen too clearly. "Fancy, Miss Trent." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes were piercing. "You've been quick to cast suspicion on Clara, but your own observations have been selective. You saw Philip in the library at night, didn't you? And you've used your gossip to stir discord. perhaps hoping to shift attention from your own curiosity about the amulet. Miss Trent flushed, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Before she could retort, Miss Marple turned to Dr. Vance, who had been watching with a strained smile, his pipe unlit in his hand. "And you, Dr. Vance, have shown a keen interest in Philip's work. I've noticed the scent of your tobacco in the library after hours, and the creak of the floorboards suggests you've been there when you thought no one would know. Were you looking for the amulet, perhaps, to settle a debt or two?" Dr. Vance's smile vanished, his ruddy face paling. "This is preposterous," he blustered, but his voice cracked, and his hands shook as he set down his pipe. The room was silent, save for the pop of a log in the fire, and Miss Marple let the moment stretch, knowing the weight of truth would press hardest in the quiet. It was Philip who broke first. He stood, his shoulders slumping as though a great burden had shifted. "Enough," he said, his voice low but steady. "Miss Marple's right. I found an amulet in the chamber, a golden relic, inscribed with symbols tied to an ancient cult. It's priceless, yes, but it's also unsettling. I hid it in the library to keep it safe until I could decide what to do. I didn't want anyone to know, not even you, Eleanor." He glanced at his stepmother, his eyes filled with regret. Clara, her voice barely a whisper, spoke next. "I overheard Philip and Dr. Vance talking about it, its value, its history. I was curious, yes, and maybe a bit greedy. I went to the ruins thinking I might find something else, but I didn't take anything, I swear it." Her eyes sought Philip's, pleading for understanding, but he looked away, his jaw tight. Miss Trent, her face blotched with indignation, sputtered, "I only wanted to protect this family. Clara's an outsider, always scheming. I saw her creeping about and I thought she was up to no good. But I never touched that wretched amulet." Miss Marple's gaze settled on Dr. Vance, who seemed to shrink under its weight. "And you, Dr. Vance," she prompted gently, "what was your part in this?" He sagged in his chair, his hands covering his face. "I'm ruined," he muttered, his voice breaking. "Debts, gambling mostly. I heard Philip talk of the amulet, its worth. I thought if I could get it, sell it quietly, no one would know. I searched the library, but I never found it." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I broke the vase, hoping to scare Philip into moving the amulet somewhere I could reach it. I'm sorry." Mrs. Grayson's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was firm. "Harold, how could you? And Philip, why didn't you trust me?" The hurt in her tone was a knife, and Philip flinched. Miss Marple, her expression softening, spoke quietly. "People hide things for many reasons, fear, shame, or even love. But the truth, once unearthed, has a way of setting things right." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The amulet should be secured, Philip, perhaps given to a museum where it can be studied safely. And as for the rest, forgiveness is often the hardest but most necessary step." The room exhaled, the tension easing like a knot slowly untying. Miss Marple stepped back, her role as catalyst complete. The household would mend, she knew, though scars would remain. As she picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, not through confrontation, but through the patient unraveling of human hearts. Chapter 8. The quiet resolution. The clouds that had hung heavy over Thornfield Hall lifted the following morning, and a pale sun bathed the estate in a tentative glow, as though nature itself sensed the resolution of the storm within. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting bag at her side, a cup of tea steaming gently on the table before her. The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a mantel clock and the distant chirp of sparrows in the garden. The household, still reeling from the revelations of the previous day, moved with a subdued air. But Miss Marple noted a shift, a lightness, as if the air had been cleared of a lingering miasma. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson had taken charge with a quiet resolve that belied her earlier anxiety. She had summoned the local constable, a discreet man with a weathered face, to deal with Dr. Harold Vance. The physician, his genial mask discarded, had confessed fully to his attempt to steal the amulet, driven by debts that had spiraled beyond his control. He was escorted from Thornfield with a promise of leniency, provided he sought help for his gambling. Mrs. Grayson, though shaken by the betrayal of a trusted friend, bore it with dignity, her pearl brooch glinting as she spoke calmly of moving forward. Philip Grayson, his secret laid bare, had acted swiftly to secure the golden amulet. He contacted a colleague at the British Museum, arranging for the relic to be collected and studied under proper academic care. "It's safer there," he told Miss Marple over breakfast, his voice steady, but his eyes shadowed with lingering guilt. "I should have been honest from the start. I thought I was protecting everyone, but I only caused more trouble." Miss Marple, spreading marmalade on her toast, offered a gentle smile, assuring him that even the best intentions could tangle like poorly knitted wool. Clara Beaumont, her vivacity tempered by the ordeal, had sought out Philip in the garden that morning. Miss Marple, from her window, observed their quiet conversation, noting the tentative way Clara touched his arm and the slow nod of his response. They were not yet fully reconciled. Trust, once bruised, mended slowly, but there was hope in their shared glances, a promise of rebuilding what had been strained. Clara's greed, born of a moment's weakness, seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a chastened sincerity that Miss Marple found promising. Miss Lydia Trent, her sharp tongue silenced by the exposure of her own role in stirring discord, had made a stilted apology to Clara, prompted by Mrs. Grayson's firm insistence. "I may have been overzealous," she muttered, her face flushed with the effort of humility. Clara accepted it with a nod, though her eyes remained wary. Miss Marple, overhearing the exchange, reflected that Miss Trent's envy would not vanish overnight, but a public humbling might curb her malice, at least for a time. As Miss Marple prepared to depart Thornfield, her small suitcase packed and her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, Mrs. Grayson sought her out in the entrance hall. The older woman's grey eyes were warm with gratitude, though a trace of weariness lingered. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice soft. "You saw through our muddle when we were all too close to it. I feel as though we've been given a second chance." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "People are often their own worst enemies, Mrs. Grayson, but they're also capable of remarkable resilience. You've a fine family here and a strong heart to guide it. Keep them close, and the rest will sort itself out." She patted Mrs. Grayson's hand, her touch light but reassuring. The train to Danefield was punctual, its whistle cutting through the crisp autumn air. As Miss Marple settled into her seat, her knitting bag tucked beside her. Through the window, she watched the countryside unfold. fields golden with stubble, hedgerows ablaze with hawthorn berries, and the distant spire of Athens church piercing the skyline. Her thoughts drifted to the clay fragment, now safely stored with her other keepsakes, a memento of a mystery solved not through grand gestures, but through the quiet observation of human frailties. She opened a novel, its pages worn from many readings, but her mind lingered on Thornfield. The amulet, with its ancient secrets, was no longer a threat, its power diminished by the light of truth. Dr. Vance's desperation, Clara's temptation, Miss Trent's spite, Philip's fear, all were threads in a pattern as old as time, woven from the same impulses Miss Marple had seen in her village of Danefield. Greed, envy, fear, and love. They were the constants, predictable yet ever varied, like the stitches in her knitting. As the train rattled on, she smiled faintly, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The world, she mused, was full of puzzles, each waiting for a patient hand to unravel it. For now, she was content to return to her cottage, to her garden and her neighbours, where new stories, new secrets, would no doubt find her. With a contented sigh, she turned a page, ready to let the next chapter unfold in its own time.